Can knowledge harm the one who possesses it? It seems absurd at first. Knowledge is supposed to liberate, to refine, to guide. The more you know, the more capable you become, or so modern culture assumes. Yet Imam Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali, one of the most influential thinkers in Islamic philosophy, issued a warning that feels increasingly relevant today. Knowledge, without action, betrays its possessor. He observed that the intellect, meant to illuminate, can also deceive when it never transforms behavior. When knowledge remains theoretical, it strengthens illusion rather than dissolving it. In the 21st century, this danger has only intensified. We live in an age of infinite access to information, yet wisdom and emotional maturity remains scarce. Humanity knows more than ever, yet struggles to live well. The question Al-Ghazali forces us to confront is simple but unsettling. Why does knowing without doing lead to self-betrayal? And what kind of knowledge truly transforms the self rather than merely inflating it? Modern psychology gives language to what Al-Ghazali sensed centuries ago, the condition we might call cognitive inflation, an excess of intellectual input without behavioral output. We are surrounded by educational content, podcasts, self-improvement books, online courses, but most of this knowledge remains in what psychologists call declarative memory, facts we can recall, discuss, and even teach. Yet behavioral change requires something else: procedural memory, the memory that governs doing, habit, an embodied skill, according to the Hebbian principle in neuroscience. Neurons that fire together, wire together. Transformation only occurs through repetition and engagement. Simply understanding an idea does not rewire the brain. Acting upon it does. When we consume information without applying it, the brain rewards us with a short-term dopamine spike, the pleasure of learning without the labor of transformation. This produces the illusion of growth. You feel wiser, but you remain unchanged. The psychological cost of this gap is cognitive dissonance, the tension between what you know and how you live. The greater the knowledge, the deeper the dissonance. In social life, this manifests as virtue signaling, the public display of ethical understanding, unaccompanied by private embodiment. It is precisely this condition, knowing but not becoming, that Al-Ghazali identified as the most dangerous disease of scholars. Imam Al-Ghazali lived in the 11th century, a theologian, jurist, and mystic who sought to reunite intellect and spirituality. His monumental work, Ulam al-Din, the revival of the religious sciences, redefined what it meant to know. He wrote that the scholar who does not act on his knowledge resembles a candle that gives light to others while burning itself. In his analysis, the intellect that shines outward but fails to illuminate the self is incomplete. It creates reputation, not realization. Al-Ghazali divided knowledge into two forms: ilm al-lisan, the knowledge of the tongue, verbal, theoretical, external; ilm lyl, the knowledge of state, lived, internal, transformative. For him, the question was never, what do you know, but what has your knowledge done to you? This ethical demand sets the stage for his radical claim that knowledge, when divorced from action, ceases to be knowledge and becomes betrayal, not of truth itself, but of the one who holds it. Al-Ghazali described knowledge as newer light. Light reveals reality, but it also exposes the moral duty to act in accordance with what is seen. The problem, he said, arises when the intellect uses this light to analyze everything except itself. He wrote, "The learned man who does not act is like a blind man carrying a lamp. Modern cognitive science echoes this insight through the concept of metacognitive illusion, the tendency to overestimate understanding simply because one can describe it. Exposure to ideas creates a false sense of mastery. Neuroscience adds another layer, the dopaminergic loop of informational pleasure. The act of acquiring new information triggers the brain's reward system, producing satisfaction independent of transformation. We become addicted to learning about change instead of changing. Al-Ghazali's logic is clear and uncompromising. The more one knows, the greater the responsibility to align with that knowledge. Intellectual clarity without ethical embodiment does not lead to wisdom, it leads to hypocrisy. The light that should guide becomes a mirror that flatters. Al-Ghazali believed the real threat was not ignorance, but the ego's exploitation of knowledge. Knowledge, when filtered through self-interest, becomes a tool for pride. He warned that the learned person easily mistakes verbal mastery for spiritual proximity. To articulate truth is not to embody it. Modern psychology describes a similar effect through the Dunning-Kruger bias, where partial understanding breeds overconfidence. Neuroscience locates this in the brain's default mode network, the system associated with self-referential thinking. When activated, even acts of reflection are subtly hijacked to maintain a positive self-image. In this way, the intellect can become self-justifying rather than self-correcting. Al-Ghazali diagnosed this condition as the hidden arrogance of the learned. Knowledge becomes armor, a defense against humility rather than a mirror for self-examination. We see this dynamic in modern life as well. People deeply versed in theories of mindfulness or ethics who remain trapped in unexamined ego patterns. The understanding becomes part of identity rather than a tool for transformation. As Al-Ghazali put it, knowledge that does not break the self strengthens it. The betrayal of knowledge begins when the intellect serves pride instead of truth. How, then, can we distinguish genuine knowledge from illusion? For Al-Ghazali, the test was simple. Action, he wrote. Knowledge calls for action. If action does not follow, knowledge departs. In psychological terms, behavior is the external signature of internal coherence. To know and not act is to create a fracture between cognition and will. Neuroscience describes a similar principle through neuroplastic consistency. Unused neural pathways degrade over time. In other words, enacted knowledge literally fades from the brain's structure. Moral psychology calls this the intention-behavior gap, the space between what we value and what we do. Over time, this gap erodes integrity and self-trust. Al-Ghazali saw this as a form of spiritual entropy. When knowledge is not translated into conduct, it decays into self-deception. The soul begins to rot not from ignorance, but from the hypocrisy of knowing what it refuses to live. True scholarship, he argued, is measured not by the refinement of ideas, but by the refinement of behavior. Action is the proof of knowledge, just as movement is the proof of life at the highest level. Al-Ghazali reframed knowledge itself. He saw it not as accumulation, but as integration. Knowledge must pass through the furnace of sincerity, and practice more to become realization. He distinguished between informational knowledge, which changes what you think, and transformational knowledge, which changes what you are. Modern neuroscience supports this through the idea of neurocognitive integration. When intellectual learning connects with emotional and behavioral circuits, producing stable change, Psychologists now refer to this as embodied cognition, the process through which thought becomes lived pattern. Al-Ghazali understood this centuries earlier. For him, the journey from knowing compassion to being compassionate is not a moral metaphor. It is the essence of transformation. His forbidden secret was that knowledge, when not enacted, reverses polarity. It no longer enlightens the soul, but corrupts it. The intellect becomes a thief of sincerity, stealing the appearance of virtue while withholding its substance. In simple terms, the intellect without virtue becomes illusion. Virtue without intellect becomes blindness. True wisdom unites both. Beneath all of Al-Ghazali's reasoning lies a principle of alignment. He saw the human being as composed of three faculties: intellect, akl, will, irada, and action, amal. When these align, the person becomes whole. When they diverge, fragmentation arises. Knowledge activates cognition. Will directs intention. Action manifests truth. The absence of any one creates distortion. Philosophically, he compared knowledge to potential energy. Without action, it remains static, trapped in the mind's storage. Action converts it into kinetic reality. Unreleased potential stagnates, and stagnation breeds corruption. Ethical psychology supports this logic. When internal values and external actions conflict, the psyche experiences fragmentation and guilt. The more refined the intellect, the more painful this fragmentation becomes. Hence, the betrayal of knowledge is proportional to awareness. The more clearly you see, the greater the suffering when you do not act. Contemporary mindfulness research has confirmed this pattern. Insight without ethical grounding can heighten self-focus, producing what psychologists call spiritual narcissism. Al-Ghazali's logic remains consistent. Knowledge validates itself only when enacted. Otherwise, it falsifies the very truth it claims to serve. How then can this ancient principle guide modern life? Al-Ghazali's insight translates seamlessly into behavioral science. Knowledge must cross the bridge between cognition and embodiment. Three practical principles help achieve this integration. First, the micro-action principle. Transformation begins with small, repeated actions. Behavioral activation theory shows that micro-habits are more effective than abstract intentions because they engage procedural memory. Reading about patience changes little. Practicing one deliberate act of patience rewires the brain. Second, the reflection principle. Continuous self-observation prevents the ego from misusing knowledge. In psychology, this aligns with metacognitive awareness training, noticing when the mind turns understanding into self-defense. Reflection converts learning into humility. Third, the embodiment principle. To prevent dissociation between knowing and being, tie every new insight to a concrete behavior within 24 hours. Habit formation studies confirm that immediate enactment consolidates learning far more effectively than delayed reflection. Consider compassion. Reading about it lights the intellect. Acting on it, even once, ingrains it. Reflecting on the experience aligns emotion with understanding. This cycle, learn, act, reflect, converts abstract knowledge into neural and moral structure. Ethical neuroscience confirms. Al-Ghazali's intuition, moral behavior strengthens. The brain's empathy networks more deeply than intellectual reasoning alone. Virtue, in modern terms, is embodied neural architecture. Through this lens, Al-Ghazali's framework becomes a precise manual for psychological coherence. The so-called forbidden secret in Al-Ghazali's teaching is not hidden mysticism, it is ethical responsibility. Knowledge demands embodiment. When understanding does not translate into behavior, it fractures the self. Cognitive science confirms what Al-Ghazali saw through spiritual introspection. The brain and the soul require coherence between thought, intention, and act. True learning therefore leaves measurable traces in both conduct and consciousness. Al-Ghazali summarized it with elegant simplicity. The proof of knowledge is action. The proof of action is sincerity. To know is to be obligated. To act is to confirm. To act sincerely is to unify. In an age that worships information, Al-Ghazali's warning is not antiquated, it is urgent. The mind that collects truth without living it becomes its own deceiver. So, the question remains, in a world where knowledge is limitless, can you bear the responsibility of what you already know?